The world of storytelling involves two opposing forces, innovation and censorship. Whether it's old school library burning or today's content-focused witch hunts, some people always want to clamp down on narratives they find distasteful. And on the other hand, there will always be artists testing the waters of what is possible with narrative. Social norms be damned. And although comic books are a pretty free medium at this point, in that any publisher can at least put out almost anything they want, up until very recently, censorship had a firm grip on the industry. How that tide changed has a lot to do with Vertigo Comics and the company's editor-in-chief, Karen Berger. Vertigo was an imprint of DC Comics that existed from 1993 to 2020, which puts it in the company of 27 club members like Janis Joplin, Robert Johnson, and Jimi Hendrix. Throughout its existence, Vertigo operated as, in broad terms, the mature readers arm of the DC publishing empire, putting out comics that were more experimental and adult than the rest of DC's line. Vertigo launched the career of Neil Gaiman, developed popular characters like John Constantine, helped popularize the trade paperback format of comic publishing, and provided material for a grip of Hollywood adaptations like V for Vendetta, Preacher, Sandman, Why the Last Man, and Sweet Tooth. However, the most important impact Vertigo had on the world at large was to progress comics beyond juvenile superhero fare. Most independent US comics today are operating off the precedents set by Vertigo and its creators. The story of Vertigo begins with the Comics Code. In the USA, comics in genres like crime and horror were very popular in the era surrounding the World Wars, but that wasn't meant to last. In the 1950s, there was a moral panic about comics in the United States, which was basically a bunch of squares claiming that comics were ruining the minds of children. One of the main texts of the panic was a book called The Seduction of the Innocent, which laid out the quack science the movement was based on. As with any US moral panic, there's a grain of truth. A kid reading a 1950s crime comic was going to be more familiar with criminal tactics, and yeah, that could hypothetically lead them to sticking someone up or something, but things immediately get blown way out of proportion, to an unreal degree. This time, the moral panic resulted in the Comics Code Authority, which was established in 1954 as a sort of industry self-censorship organization. A book that met the Comics Code had the Authority's logo on the cover. Now, this may not sound so bad, but the code was just ridiculous. For example, evil could never win in any plot in a code-compliant comic. In addition, anything deemed a sexual abnormality was banned. The list is the answer for anyone wondering why US comics are so much dumber than Japanese manga or European BDs, as the Comics Code made the scope of stories that could be told in US comics extremely narrow, and that code held for way too long. Things began to change in the 1980s. In 1984, an issue of Swamp Thing was rejected by the Authority, but DC decided just to publish the series without the logo. Another early series that avoided the code was Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, which included a multi-gender character that definitely broke the rules. Marvel would abandon the Comics Code in 2001, while DC kept deferring to it until 2011, with the notable exception of the entire Vertigo Comics line. Vertigo was basically the first mainstream comics imprint to exist completely outside of the Comics Code, and the imprint was pretty revolutionary in that sense alone. For most of its existence, Vertigo's editor-in-chief was Karen Berger, who ran the show for 20 years between 1993 and 2013. Berger basically was Vertigo, but her first big contribution to comics was her role in what is known as the British Invasion. Another big figure in the formation of Vertigo is Alan Moore, the British writer that wrote Watchmen, even though he never actually wrote for Vertigo itself. Alan Moore began writing Swamp Thing for DC in 1983, becoming the first Brit to work in modern US comics. And in 1984, Karen Berger began editing that series. After working with Moore, in 1986, Berger began recruiting writers in the UK and Ireland to write for DC, specifically for series that were marked for mature readers. She found that British and Irish writers were edgier, which probably had to do with the thriving underground UK comics industry, which didn't have a Comics Code Authority to deal with. Berger would recruit now legendary UK and Irish writers to helm mature DC titles before the creation of Vertigo. Neil Gaiman wrote Sandman, Grant Morrison wrote Animal Man and Doom Patrol, Peter Milligan wrote Shade the Changing Man, and Jamie Delano wrote Hellblazer, which starred a character created by Alan Moore named John Constantine. Vertigo basically began as an extension of the British invasion. When the imprint was launched in 1993, the original lineup was Sandman, Hellblazer, Shade, Animal Man, Doom Patrol, and Swamp Thing, all series that had previously been published as mainstream DC titles and were part of the British invasion. But soon enough, original works like Peter Milligan's Enigma, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, and Garth Ennis' Preacher would set the tone for what Vertigo would become, which was a place for creators, mostly writers already working on mainstream DC properties, to launch independent projects based on brand new intellectual property. Basically, it was a way to publish your dream comic using the resources of a major publishing company, and DC put a lot of money into Vertigo. The imprint would go on to host a grip of landmark comic book series between its launch in 1993 and its final breath in 2020, most of which were completely unrelated to the DC universe at large. The most famous of these that I haven't mentioned yet would be Transmetropolitan, 100 Bullets, The Unwritten, Scalp, Northlanders, Astro City, DMZ, Punk Rock Jesus, American Vampire, The Losers, Unknown Soldier, Human Target, We Three, and Fables, but there are just way too many notable ones to fit here. Vertigo titles launched the career of several notable visual artists, including Dave McKean and James John. And some of the successful writers who got their start at Vertigo and have worked outside of comics would be Grant Morrison, Brian K. Vaughan, Ed Brubaker, Garth Ennis, and obviously literary superstar Neil Gaiman. And the list of high-profile Vertigo creators that continue to work in comics today is too massive to put here. In addition to the content of Vertigo's titles, the company changed the comic book format as well. Modern comics publishing largely operates by printing single issues of a comic series, then collecting several of those issues into one bigger book known as a trade paperback. And that publishing practice originated with Vertigo and Karen Berger. Vertigo died due to corporate shakeups within DC. It is unclear exactly what happened, probably because of the non-disclosure agreements that are common in the comics industry, but Karen Berger left Vertigo in 2013 amid intra-company power shifts at DC. The nuts and bolts here aren't entirely relevant, but in basic terms, Marvel's profitable cinematic universe put the pressure on DC to have similar success. This resulted in extreme upheaval at DC, which in 2015 moved its overall corporate headquarters to the center of the Hollywood movie industry in Burbank, California. Now, the move was symbolic of DC's shifting priorities. Around this time, the focus of companies like DC and Marvel basically shifted from selling comic books direct to comic book fans to just farming intellectual property for film and TV, with comic fans being an afterthought. If that sounds harsh, well, let's just say the situation is what it is. In any case, the end of Vertigo was gradual, and it died a shadow of its former self. There were stories of editors telling creators to work with other publishers because the ship was sinking, and then it sank. These days, independent publishers the likes of Image, Boom, Vault, Black Mask, Scout, and AWA are where to look for experimental and groundbreaking storytelling in comic book format, and DC's Black Label imprint is where to go for their more adult-oriented comics, which have included the Joker sleeping with Harley Quinn and even Bruce Wayne's junk. But it's important to remember that Vertigo was a vital moment in the history of storytelling. It literally opened the gates for US comics creators to address issues that had been taboo, and it did it with swagger. Vertigo classics like Sandman, The Invisibles, or Garth Ennis' Hellblazer run still largely hold up, and the imprint's output in general is an impressive artifact that I would encourage everyone to check out. And, in terms of the works produced during and through the British invasion, and the industry shifts that would later result from Vertigo, it's important to note that we have Karen Berger to thank for it all. So cheers, Karen. This has been another map video. Give it a like if you learned something, subscribe to see more, and comment if we got something wrong. Check below to see any corrections, and I'll put some links to classic comics in the description, where you can also find a link to our Patreon. Peace.